recycling this laughably ignorant argument that nobody with even a child's level understanding of the Quran would take seriously.
A lot of what was said in Arazafar's recent response was either just completely redundant, he repeated himself a lot, or red herrings on his part. So I'm going to focus on his major points, which affect our discussion the most. The first issue is Arazafar's claim that the Quran clearly defines the Torah and Gospel as a message given to Moses and Jesus. Arazafar throws up verses on the screen that says the Torah was a revelation given to Moses, or the Gospel was given to Jesus. Therefore, he concludes, anytime we see the words Gospel or Torah, it can't be understood as referring to a set of physical texts, since supposedly the Quran has elsewhere defined these words by saying they were given to various people. This is a central tenet of Arazafar's argument, so I'm going to take several minutes to really emphasize how bad this reasoning is. This is a massive philosophical blunder on Arazafar's part based on a complete misunderstanding of the nature of language. When it comes to messages that convey information, we often refer to the physical mediums through which that information is conveyed by using the same language or the same labels we would use to refer to the message itself. Let me give an example. Suppose I walk into any church on a Sunday morning and I hold this object up. And I ask various people, what am I holding up? Most of them would probably say, like, the Bible. It would be stupid for me to turn around and say, no, the Bible was written over 2,000 years ago on papyrus, and this was made recently on printed paper. Therefore, you shouldn't call this the Bible. You must be referring to something else. If I flipped to Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, and I pointed it, and I asked people, what's that? They would probably say, oh, that's the Lord's Prayer. It would be stupid for me to say, oh no, the Lord's Prayer is a spoken message that Jesus revealed to his disciples. And what I just pointed to is ink and paper. Therefore, that can't be the Lord's Prayer. What's funny is I can actually use you as an example of this issue. You say the Quran teaches something, and then you put up pictures of a digital English translation. Arazafar, don't you know the Quran was a message revealed to Muhammad, and therefore you can't refer to the pixels on your screen or your computer or to any books on your shelf by calling them the Quran. This is all, of course, extremely stupid, but unfortunately, this is your argument. If one thinks that a physical text accurately conveys the Torah given to Moses, it is completely normal to refer to that physical object as the Torah. So pointing to all of these passages in an attempt to say that, oh no, there's this rigid definition, it's just revelation, none of that crap's going to work. And what's especially hilarious about this is that I can cite Quran verses to support my point here. As Surah 253 and Surah 287 has Allah saying, we gave Moses the book. Surah 4:136 also refers to a book which was sent down before Muhammad. Surah 3:93 says, bring the Torah and read it, implying that Muhammad uses Torah to refer to books that they had with them, contradicting your entire argument. Surah 7:157 says that we are supposed to find Muhammad written in the Torah and the Gospel, which again indicates that Torah and Gospel are being used to refer to physical text, since that's, kind of how things are written. So this whole argument is just embarrassing on your part. The next central claim in Arazafar's argument is the idea that the Quran clearly teaches textual corruption. Let's look at the verses he presents to argue this. The first is Surah 5:13, which says that they changed words from their context. There is nothing about the existing physical text being corrupted in this verse. That is something you are reading into it. It is also interesting that you conveniently quote the translation that specifically leaves out the mention of context. Similarly, forgetting something in the text does not entail a changing of the physical text. So this verse won't avail you there. Now, Arazafar argues that you can't forget something if you still have it with you, but that's silly. Yes, you can forget things even if there is an existing text that conveys that information. I have read the book of Revelations numerous times, yet a few days ago my friend reminded me of a section in it which I had sincerely forgotten. The fact that I forgot it speaks to the failure of my memory, not the failure of the text. I suspect we have all forgotten things that we read in college textbooks. The fact that we forgot those things does not entail the original textbook no longer exists. The second verse that Arazafar tries to use to support textual corruption is Surah 2:79. Let's begin by noting that this verse is quite vague. It does not mention the Torah or Gospel specifically, but even more importantly, even many early Muslim commentators commentators do not interpret this passage in the way that Ar-Razaphar does. We see in the writings of Makadal and Al-Tabari, along with later commentators, two general interpretations of this passage. The first is that this is in specific reference to the Jews in Medina who were removing or changing descriptions of Muhammad that were in their Torah as a response to not wanting to recognize Muhammad's authority. The second interpretation is that they were writing separate interpretations of the Torah, and they were passing these off as from God, and they were selling these interpretations of the Torah for money. Let's look at each one of these more closely and see how they fail to support Ar-Razaphar's point. So the first interpretation, which is that the Jews in Muhammad's time were altering descriptions of Muhammad contained in the Torah, that would not support Ar-Razaphar's argument. There were other Jews and other Torahs during the 7th century besides the ones that were near Muhammad. So if the Jews in Medina altered a text because they wanted to avoid recognizing Muhammad, that would not affect Torahs 1,000 miles away, and nor would other Jews thousands of miles away necessarily embrace that. Second is if this verse is referring to something that is happening at the time of Muhammad, in the 7th century, that wouldn't affect the reliability of the Torah before his time. We have copies of the Torah long before Muhammad. So some random Jews in the 7th century altering things would not be an issue. This brings me to my second point regarding this interpretation, which is that we can look at Torahs before the 7th century and see if they had any pesky descriptions of Muhammad which needed to be removed. And alas, there aren't any. It's almost like a bunch of these Muslim commentators just didn't know what the Torah said. We'll come back to that idea later. But what about the second interpretation, which is that 279 is in reference to something that the Jews created outside the Torah? It's a completely different text, and that they were passing this off as being from God so that they could get money. This also would not give us reason to think the Torah was corrupt, as the thing in discussion is just something completely separate. And again, this would predate the 7th century. Thus, this argument is unsuccessful. This brings up the final surah that Ar-Razafar references, which is Surah from 4:157. There are two ways to interpret this verse. The first way to interpret this verse is that it is denying that Jesus was crucified. The second way to interpret this verse is that it is denying that the Jews were the ones responsible for the crucifixion. They're over here boasting and bragging, we killed the Messiah, and this verse could be interpreted as saying, oh no, it wasn't you who did this, it was by God's will or something like that. And before you Muslims start getting all upset about this second interpretation, this is an interpretation that some Muslim scholars have proposed, so it is worth mentioning here. However, I know that Ar-Razafar embraces the first interpretation, so let's get going with that. Let's suppose I came up to you on Monday and I said, I believe in the Quran. I think it's the word of Allah revealed by his messenger Muhammad, and I think everything in it is true. Suppose on Tuesday I come back and I tell you, I believe Jesus is God's son, the Trinity is true, Jesus was killed on the cross, and that he rose from the dead. What I said on Tuesday would not change the fact that I explicitly affirmed the Quran on Monday. It would be insane to think that because of what I said on Tuesday, my remarks on Monday were about a completely different Quran than what everybody else is reading. The most obvious thing to conclude would be that I just didn't know what I was saying on Monday, or maybe that I changed my mind later. Similarly, if the Quran says something which contradicts the Gospels, that does not change the fact that it affirms the Gospels. This is just a dumb argument. It does not justify you jumping through all these hoops to create a phantom gospel that Muhammad must have been referring to. No, Muhammad most likely just didn't know very much about what all the Gospel said, which really wouldn't be that surprising if he was illiterate, as you all claim he was.
You're wrong. All of it was not faithfully preserved.
This is the final idea I want to address since my time is running short. The Quran explicitly says that nobody can change Allah's words in Surah 615 and 547. Yet you are saying that people changed the Gospel and Torah, which we are explicitly told in the Quran is from Allah. And before you say, oh, those verses are referring to the Quran, not Allah's words in general, that's not what it says. It says nobody can change Allah's words. You suggest that these works are partially corrupt. This is not an avenue for you. As I mentioned in my original video, Allah chastises the Jews for accepting some scriptures and rejecting the others in Surah 285. Finally, the Quran explicitly says in Surah 355 that Allah will cause the true followers of Christ to be elevated above the disbelievers until the day of judgment. And Surah 61:14 affirms that this has happened and that the true followers of Christ have prevailed. So you really can't say that Jesus' gospel was corrupted, because if so, that would mean the Quran is just straight up wrong in these verses. According to you, the gospel was so corrupted so badly and so early that we don't have any inclination of Jesus' actual message until the 7th century. And the corruption of this message led to the dominant view of Christ being that he died, rose again, and was divine. This sure doesn't seem like Allah caused the true followers of Christ to prevail over their enemies until the day of judgment. Allah is apparently so incompetent at protecting the true believers, he can't even get a book published until 600 years after the corrupted accounts are already mainstream. What a God.